Thank you, Mark. Conscious that I'm speaking towards the end of an afternoon when you've already had some stimulating speeches and a long session and coffee beckons. So I'll try and keep this to the point and maybe provoke some questions and some discussion afterwards too. I've got three lifelong passions. One is education, which has been the topic of discussion in the last session. One has been Scotland, as a patriot, not a nationalist. And the other has been north-south inequality, particularly in relation to Africa. I grew up on an island which was predominantly white, almost exclusively white in population, predominantly Protestant, Church of Scotland, and almost entirely Scottish too. And for some reason I wrote my first essay on apartheid and the evils of apartheid when I was about 14 at school. Something caught my attention. I think it was the Soweto massacre, where school children were slaughtered in South Africa for trying to improve their schooling. And something caught my attention, and I've had this lifelong passion. So if I concentrate what I say mainly on the African experience rather than necessarily what's happening today in Afghanistan or what's happened over the last 40 years or so in the Middle East, that doesn't mean I'm not interested in these other conflicts and areas, and perhaps we can touch on them in questions. But I wanted to explain where the interest came from. I've had the enormous pleasure and privilege in my life to be part of a really significant, peaceful constitutional change. The change to bring devolution to Scotland, relatively substantial autonomy to Scotland within the United Kingdom, has happened peacefully by consent, unlike perhaps some other changes even in Western Europe, never mind in Eastern Europe and further afield. And I've also had the incredible experience over the last 2 years of visiting over 20 countries which either had or were affected by UN or EU missions on peacekeeping and peace building, and to try and learn from that experience and become an advocate for change in peace building and post-conflict reconstruction internationally. I hope that you can understand my accent. I was very interested in this morning's discussion, that I think if the discussion on WikiLeaks had taken place in Western Europe as opposed to here, we'd have spent almost all the time discussing whether or not the UK should extradite Julian Assange to Sweden, and whether the Swedish judicial system was being interfered with by Washington in order to get him there so that they could get him here. And that didn't even come up in the course of an hour and a quarter here in Washington this morning. So it kind of shows where different perspectives can lie, and how what is said can sometimes be in the eye of or the ear of those who are listening. And my favourite story from my time as First Minister, I used to love opening new schools, as all politicians do. And the last new school that I opened when I was First Minister, just outside Glasgow, a fantastic new school building, shiny new school, pupils, teachers, shiny on the day, everybody dressed up, and fantastic opening ceremony, gone really well. I was delighted. It was always a good boost, the pre-election period, to open a new school. And afterwards I was taken off the stage down to the head teacher's room to do a radio interview. And there was one boy, there's always one boy in every school, sitting outside the head teacher's room on a seat with his head down. And as a former school teacher, which I am, I couldn't resist the opportunity to stop and have a word with him, which I did. Unfortunately, I couldn't think of anything particularly creative to say. So, having asked him, first of all, why he was there, and he mumbled something into his chest, and pursued the issue and said, had he been in trouble that morning? And he said, yes, I've been in trouble and I'm waiting for the head teacher. I thought, right, what can I say here that might threaten him? I can't give him a school punishment because I'm not a teacher anymore. But I'm First Minister, I'll try something else. And I said, do you realise that I'm in charge of all the prisons in Scotland? And he, this is absolutely true, he looked up at me with a smile on his face and said, you'll have met my big brother then. Of course, was in the prisons. I believe, and my contention today is that post-conflict reconstruction and peace building is the most difficult, but also the most important development challenge of our time. I think one of the reasons that it's most difficult is that it's not particularly sexy for the very, very generous philanthropists who fund international schemes on HIV or on malaria or education, and many of the other water, many other big development challenges of our time. It's very challenging for NGOs because it means sometimes mixing with, dealing with, working with governments that are unpleasant, unprincipled, and trying to move them in the right direction. And it's too long term for politicians and national governments who like to see more short-term, more immediate results as part of the normal electoral cycles. But that doesn't make it any less important. 1 billion people in our world today live in fragile states. 22 of the 34 countries in the world that are most likely to miss the Millennium Development Goals are fragile. They're either in or they are emerging from conflict. And half of the world's children who are expected to die before their fifth birthday live in fragile states and are affected by, obviously, the political security climate that they and their families live in. Fragile states have, of course, become havens for narcotics traders and for terrorists, but they also have an impact beyond their borders in other ways, in the wider neighbourhood. There's an old African saying that says that rain doesn't fall only on one roof, and it's true certainly also that conflict, even in one country, an internal conflict, doesn't only affect that country, it affects the neighbouring countries and those who live in those neighbouring countries too. So while the attention we need to give to fragility, to conflict, to post-conflict reconstruction is important for our own security, it's also, in my view, important for reasons of global justice. And it's important because thus far the international system has abjectly failed to deal with post-conflict reconstruction in a way that's effective. We have an international system that is still, perhaps, as I said yesterday, with the exception of the development of the G20 and the optimism I think that should give us for a new world order, an international system that is largely based on managing the Cold War, managing the post-Second World War experience, a UN Security Council, UN institutions that are based on many of the fears and hostilities of that period, rather than the world of the 21st century that we live in today. And as a result of that, we know there are various statistics on this, but to choose one of them, they're fairly consistent. About a third of the peace agreements that are made that bring conflicts to an end break down within 5 years, and the conflicts re-emerge. And in an age when we have those international institutions, when we have a greater understanding, when we have at least a feeling for globalization, if not necessarily the ability to engage properly in that context, I think that is a shame on those of us in the developed world who could have done so much more through those international institutions to deal with it. And I think also, I have to say, reflects badly on those large countries, not just those of us in Western Europe and in North America who have been engaged in development aid and international interventions over the years, but also those large countries who oppose international interventions and who take a very absolute approach to national sovereignty and don't really want to get involved in or comment on or interfere with what happens within national boundaries. I think that their attitude has to change as well as ours. By and large, that international intervention has been over the years too slow, too inconsistent. It's certainly been too uncoordinated, major failing of all of the international agencies and of national donors. And it's critically been really weak on leadership, on accountability of those involved, the agencies and the individuals, and really weak on outcomes. And that has led us to the situation where there are virtually no, with possible exceptions of small missions here and there that have come and gone, there are virtually no international peacekeeping, peace-building missions that have been brought to an end, that have been started by the United Nations or the other international agencies. That's an incredible situation. To my mind, one of the most remarkable is the fact that we still have a UN mission in Cyprus today, after all these decades, involved, because of a dispute between one country that's in the European Union and another country that's wanted to join the European Union, an island that's in the Mediterranean, right next to all the so-called great democracies of Europe and the great peacekeeping, peace-building operation that is the European Union. And yet today we still have a UN operation there. But right across the globe we see these peacekeeping largely, sometimes peace-building too, operations without a clear strategy to emerge from the conflict that once existed or still does into a new era where national governments can support themselves with perhaps international aid, yes, but support themselves to move forward without that conflict re-emerging. I think the main theme of this conference has been about soft power. And I think in relation to soft power, there can be no doubt that tackling this issue has to matter if we're going to be serious about using either using soft power or promoting and supporting cultural diplomacy, mutual understanding throughout the world. Unless we can deal with the international support for countries emerging from conflict, not just conflict prevention, which is hard enough, but those countries emerging from conflict, then I do believe that warm words on soft power and an inclination towards a greater cultural diplomacy and understanding in the world will always be impaired by the fact that these conflicts, some of which have gone on for decades, still exist, and we've failed to help tackle them. Now, we know, as we've heard, and I don't want to repeat things that have already been said Monday, Tuesday, or earlier today, but we particularly heard yesterday in one or two of the sessions the important ways in which conflict has changed. No longer really conflicts across the world predominantly between nation states, now much more inside nation states, much more about ideas. If they are cross-border, they tend to be in organisations that operate cross-border rather than between nations fighting across borders. But we also know that there have been, despite those difficult circumstances and the much more challenging nature of conflict, there has been the start over this past decade of a move towards greater both institutional infrastructures for tackling these problems, and also I think some relative successes starting to be seen too, and that is clearly good news. The adoption by the United Nations of responsibility to protect protocols, the movement towards actually having an understanding amongst the nations of the world that intervention, particularly in relation to genocide, but the other major crimes too, that intervention is acceptable, that there's a staged process to it, but that is there as a major step forward from where we were at the end of the 20th century. The increasing understanding of the importance of women, in particular in leadership roles, although the UN is still particularly poor at having women in leadership roles, the increasing understanding of the importance of women politicians in particular and other civic leaders taking forward that post-conflict environment is again, I think, a major step forward. The way in which the African Union has moved from the old Organisation of African Unity, which had a principle of non-intervention at its absolute core, from its founding conference back in the 1960s, of non-intervention in the affairs of a nation state, no matter what impact that had on the continent or on the people of an individual nation, to a principle in the African Union of non-indifference, where the African Union does see a role for itself in conflict prevention and in conflict resolution, I think is a very important change, and we can see even this week in the very, very difficult circumstances in the Ivory Coast at the moment, the important role being played by ECOWAS as the regional organisation and trying to drive a solution before a conflict erupts. I think that role, seems to me, is absolutely central and where the long-term solution lies, not just in West Africa or in Africa as a whole, but elsewhere in the world too. And we've seen some individual successes. I don't want to, when you start highlighting countries, everybody can come up with problems in those individual countries. I think some of what's happened in Rwanda is impressive, remarkable. I recognise there are challenges, there are issues, people have concerns, but I do think some of the things that have happened there are really quite remarkable given what happened to that country just 17 years ago. But even today, in places like Sierra Leone, there is progress. Maybe still huge difficulties to overcome, But when you think where some of these countries were 10 years ago, Timor-Leste even where it was just 5 years ago, then there is a signal that the world is starting to understand these issues more successfully, more effectively, and the individual countries have got the capacity to move on if given the right support. There are, of course, still, and it's important to raise this caveat, there are still going to be problems in individual countries, problems of corruption, problems of poor governance, the significant problem always of weak institutions. But if that stopped us doing anything, we wouldn't do anything in our own countries either, for being honest. One of my most memorable moments of the last few years when I stopped being First Minister and announced that I was going to spend a lot of time in Africa working on these and other issues. I remember being told by a Member of Parliament for Scottish constituency, but based in the UK Parliament in London, that I was wasting my time because all of these African politicians were only interested in feathering their own nest and making as much money as they could, and they weren't interested in democracy or development. And he, of course, then became one of the first members of Parliament in the UK to be highlighted for fraudulently claiming his expenses shortly afterwards. And it kind of told its own story, really. We have faults in politics in our countries too. And the fact that there are faults in politicians in the developing world should not surprise us. And it shouldn't be a bar to development and to real progress. Support and a strategy that has within it accountabilities, leadership, responsibilities spelt out for the World Bank and the UN and others, so they're not working against each other, they're not working at cross purposes, they're not doing different things that work against the strategy that has been agreed. And fourthly, and I think this is important, well, there is a very strong case, and I do endorse that these strategies must focus on the rule of law, on the creation of governing institutions, the importance of strong institutions in any long-term prospect of peace. I think there also needs to be, particularly for young combatants, there needs to be early wins in development as well. I don't think there can be any doubt that development is the mortar of peace. That institutions may be essential for peace, that democracy and the rule of law essential for peace in the longer term. But development has to be the mortar of peace, and quick wins that provide employment opportunities and infrastructure that people can see happening, so that the conflict doesn't re-emerge because of grievances and ongoing disease and poverty and all of these issues. Seems to me to be absolutely essential. So some urgency on that, early finance to make sure that people can see the benefits of peace available from the international community through those national governments has to be there. Now, I've probably spoken for long enough to move on to questions. In terms of what we in the UK, what colleagues here in the US, what those elsewhere in the developed world, and I think increasingly those who are, let's put it this way, almost developed, those that used to be developing and are now almost developed, those that contribute strongly to a world economy, that large countries that have got responsibilities on the Security Council as well as but still need to develop inside their own borders. What all of us, I think, need to do, I think, can be summarised on 3 points. First of all, there has to be a greater urgency to this. In each of those countries that I've mentioned, in the UK and Germany and the US here and elsewhere, the number of individual civilians involved in post-conflict environments to help build the capacity of those countries emerging from conflict can be counted in dozens rather than in hundreds or thousands. And I believe that there are hundreds and thousands of individuals out there, skilled individuals in the developed world, who would be willing to commit to help in these environments if they were given the right resources, backup and organisation to do that. They should never be substitutes for building capacity. They should never duplicate what could be done on the ground, but they can mentor and help and provide short-term assistance in building that capacity that's important for the longer term. And the level of urgency given to that, I think, at the moment is simply not good enough. The second would be in relation to finance. It seems to me staggering that in the 21st century we have 120,000 UN troops in the field across the world today. We spend, I think, something like £4 billion maybe, a year on financing those operations. The annual fund of the Peacebuilding Commission in the United Nations, which is the one perhaps 21st century organisation within that 20th century institution, it's about 150 million. It seems to me that a very small percentage of that peacekeeping budget and those peacekeeping personnel redirected to post-conflict reconstruction and peace building would make a huge, huge difference across the world. And I think looking at the resources available and the urgency with which they can be applied is important for all of us, whether it's here in the US, in the UK, or what we are seeing in the international institutions where we're represented. And the third point is the point I made first previously. I think there's a need for long-term plans. I think 10-year plans, perhaps 10-year plans that also include building up those regional organisations, whether it's the African Union or the regional organisations across Africa, because people talk about Africa as if it was one country, and of course it's not. Those regional organisations, the Southern African Development Conference, the ECOWAS and others, I think in the longer term could be really, really central to conflict prevention, to the management of conflict, and then to supporting those emerging from conflict and development in the longer term. But that's also true, I think, in Southeast Asia, for example, where ASEAN could play an increasing role, and Indonesia want it too. I think it's increasingly true that there are developments in Southern and Central America. The role of Brazil and Haiti, for example, has been central to, despite all the challenges and problems, the development that's taken place there over recent years. And I think those regional operations, regional organisations, people coming together with a greater cultural understanding, more neighbourhood support. I think somebody once said to me that when you have a fire in your house, while you're waiting for the fire engine to arrive, your neighbours come and help. And I think getting the neighbours involved in these environments is absolutely essential. And 10-year plans that would do that. Not just 10-year plans for the individual countries, but 10-year plans in the EU and the UN and elsewhere for aid and development, capacity building in the regional organisations to help them in the longer term take on some of these responsibilities, I think would be very, very important. I'll finish just on one point. I'm very keen on quoting famous Scots, particularly when I'm in Washington, as we're one of the countries that claims to have written the Constitution here. I know there are a lot of countries that claim that, but we can at least, I think, claim to have influenced it. One of the people who was writing in Scotland back at that time was Robert Louis Stevenson. And one of the things that he said back then, which I think is still true today, is that we shouldn't judge each day by the harvest that we reap. We should judge it by the seeds that we have planted. And I think in post-conflict reconstruction, that's more important than anywhere else. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Lord McConnell. Be happy to take a few questions, although we can't take all of them. I can see you've inspired many. Let's maybe start here. I think you were waiting last time and we didn't get to you. So let me start with you, and then we'll come to the side.
Thank you. I'm John Freed from UPenn. My question more deals with the forum which you think is best maybe for post-conflict reconstruction. You've talked again and again about very often the failure of UN peacekeeping missions, and most people have already talked about, if not here on other stages, kind of the dysfunctional nature of the UN these days and really getting most things done. There's the UN when it comes to financing, there's the World Bank, and they don't really seem to often have much progress in their projects. So my question for you is, do you believe that with reform, let's say, the UN really could be a driving force for that, or do we need to look elsewhere, let's say, to maybe expanding the role of NATO or maybe for private coalitions of nations rather than looking with the tools that we already have?
Well, I would quite like to answer that point specifically. I'll try and do it very briefly. If there wasn't a United Nations, we would have to invent it, and it would be a damn sight more difficult to invent today than it was in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. So, I mean, I think the United Nations is the global institution that has the legitimacy to lead on these issues. The fact that it has had difficulty doing so in the past is partly a reflection of its internal bureaucracy. It's partly a reflection of the tensions between the North and the South, the old tensions between the East and the West. It's partly, I think, a reflection of the lack of consistency in those who have had an interest in this issue in the past, largely from the old West, Western Europe and North America. not pursuing the issue hard enough inside the UN and making an issue of it and making it important. It's partly a reflection of other big states at the UN blocking it, which I think in today's world might have been understandable 20 years ago. It's unforgivable today. So I think all these factors have stopped the UN making as much progress as it should. But the UN is the body with the legitimacy to lead these missions. Even if it devolves that responsibility, it still has the legitimacy to lead them. In the longer term, I'd like to see it devolving that responsibility under a UN legitimacy to those regional organisations. I think the regional organisations are the future. 10 years from now, 20 years from now, regional organisations in Africa and Asia and Latin America will be as important as the European Union is today for us in Europe.
Thank you. Let's go maybe to the right side. I'm not sure which one of you is first.
I have someone.
Yeah? Okay.
Hope it was answered.
My name is Trina Bolton, and I'm at Carnegie Mellon University, which is named after another distinguished Scottish. In light of the Comprehensive Peace Agreement and the fast-approaching Sudanese referendum, I'm just interested in your perspective on the developed world's role thus far and their use of soft and hard power, particularly the United States, and I guess the exit strategy from here on out, and if the 10 years should start now or if it should have started in 2005, and kind of your overall take on this particular peace-building process.
Yep. Again, that's quite specific, and I was discussing it this morning at the State Department, so I mean it's topical in my head, so let me just very briefly say something about it. I have a very good relationship with the President of Malawi, who is currently this year the chair of the African Union, and I know that last spring how exercised he was that his term of office was going to come to an end in late January 2011, just after the referendum, and he was very aware that the referendum this Sunday was going to be a huge event for the whole continent, not just for southern Sudan. I think a lot of people have put a lot of effort into the last 12 months, much of it unseen. Whatever mistakes were made in the past about the speed of response and intervention, I think both from Europe, but particularly from the US, give them credit, but also from elsewhere in Africa. There have been a lot of people working very, very hard, both with President Bashir, despite his indictment in the International Criminal Court, but also with the South Sudanese leadership and with the neighbouring countries, to get to a stage where this week President Bashir was willing to say publicly that he will accept the result even if it goes against him. And the South Sudanese leadership said that they welcome his statement and they'll work with him to have a peaceful transition to secession if that's indeed what the result of the referendum is. I mean, given the history of this part of the world, that is an absolutely remarkable position for us to find ourselves in 3 days before a referendum. And I genuinely hope that whatever happens on Sunday, this that what people are saying about accepting the result is indeed what comes to pass. I think it will be interesting. I mean, the other African leaders have been very strong on this, and I think that's to be welcomed. It's also perhaps interesting in that when Eritrea seceded from Ethiopia, that was meant to be the last kind of change of the 1960s borders, and it's clearly not now the case if southern Sudan might leave the rest of Sudan. But also on the positive side, I think there's a real potential with northern Uganda, Kenya, and other countries in the region, perhaps the Central African Republic, that if development and the creation of a new governance in southern Sudan does follow the referendum, that there could be development benefits across that whole region and that part of Africa. And it's a time really of huge challenges and I think fears, but it's also a time of some hope as well. And if the international community handles this properly, and they get it right, then this could be quite a remarkable change 5 years down the line. If they get it wrong, it could be disastrous. And there are going to be some very good judgments need to be made over the next few months. But I think what they've done so far has been good. Maybe not early enough, But the last 6 months or so, I think what's been happening has been good, and if it's a signal of the kind of approach there's going to be, sensitive approach, then I would err slightly on the side of optimism rather than pessimism.
Excellent. I suggest for the final question, let's go to the back of the room, just to vary that, maybe here on the right-hand side.
I'm called Herbert Barigasima from Uganda, studying in Poland. I have some kind of conflicting ideas about the international community mainly. They are doing so much, and they are good at the post-conflict reconstruction and the peace building. But there is one thing they are forgetting here mainly. They have the ability, but they always ignore the other side of preventing these conflicts before. Can you elaborate more about that? Because I realized yesterday you've been in northern Uganda. You really know what's happening. Thank you.
I could talk about my experience in northern Uganda 2 years ago for a while, and I won't because Mark's giving me that look at the back there. But I think the international community is now more aware of the benefits of conflict prevention than it has been for some time. Politicians talk more about it than they have done for some time. I think conflict prevention work always slides down the agenda of politicians because it's not as immediate as dealing with, for example, the situation in the Korean Peninsula just now or whatever. So for that reason, there needs to be people out with the kind of immediate senior politicians dealing with international conflict, international relations, who are constantly pushing the conflict prevention agenda, whether they are diplomats, sometimes military people, maybe former politicians like myself, people out there pressing the conflict prevention agenda all the time, making sure it's on the table, because otherwise immediate outbreaks of conflict or the immediate burst of international publicity around a particular location will always take a higher precedence on the desk of whether it's the US Secretary of State or anybody else for that matter. So I think we need to keep pushing conflict prevention. It's important. There are again great statistics about is it £1 spent on conflict prevention is worth £4 or £5 on conflict itself. Conflict prevention would be, in terms of all those politicians that want to see tax cuts and cuts in spending and cuts in deficits and so on, conflict prevention would be one of the greatest savers right across the world, and it needs to be given that higher priority if we can force it onto the agenda. That said, I think the best conflict prevention is done in the neighbourhood, and that's been seen in West Africa over recent times. I think if the African Union has had one success over the last few years, I think as an institution, I think it's been the move towards having and I can never get the terms exactly, the panel of the wise and all these different groups that have been put together to try and deal with conflicts before they arise. And there's now the capacity on the continent to do that. The former president of Botswana always says that when he retired as president in 1998, he was very, very lonely because there were very few former presidents still alive on the continent. Today he's a member of a very busy club, and he likes that. And so people are now available in the neighbourhood to help deal with conflict prevention, and that's true elsewhere in the world as well. And therefore, I think, again, encouraging the regional organisations and the continental organisations to take that responsibility, I think is very positive. I think it's very hard to do conflict prevention in sub-Saharan Africa from Paris. It should be done from sub-Saharan Africa if it can. Zimbabwe is a good example of that. We can't solve what's happening in Zimbabwe from London, but it can be solved by interventions from South Africa and Malawi and some of the neighbouring states. Can I just say on Uganda, though, just give a little bit of personal experience. I had a fascinating trip to Uganda 2 years ago, early on in that, taking on that responsibility for peace building. And I was struck by two things. One was that having visited northern Uganda and, for example, seen a camp of over 1,000 internally displaced people where no one had any work, they didn't even have a shed that they could keep produce in or tools that they could start some agriculture with to get something going. Now the conflict had supposedly come to an end, where there was no water in the pump, and I was told the pump would take 9 months to fix. To then meet senior figures the next day in Kampala who told me that all the problems in the north were solved. Everybody was back home, the schools had been rebuilt, and everything was fine. I think kind of showed the disconnect sometimes between and the impact that can have between politicians and the people they serve. But much more worrying was I then had a meeting with 2 meetings. First of all, with the NGOs who were involved in the north. 13 of them round the table, NGOs and agencies. Nobody clearly in the lead. Everybody doing their own thing. Nobody responsible for coordination. No pooled attempt to do the work. No overall strategy for the area. And then a meeting with the UN and the World Bank, where when I asked the question who was in charge and who would I call first if I was the Prime Minister of Uganda, the 2 individuals concerned almost left the table because they were so terrified of the discussion, never mind the answer. And I think that whole issue of coordination just struck me in an example that's not the most affected country in Africa in terms of conflict, not the most challenged today, a country that's starting to do well in many respects, but a very, very good example of how coordination and leadership, almost regardless of how much money is available and regardless of what resources there are in the country and the level of governance in the country, the international community's responsibility for governance and leadership and accountability and clarity of responsibilities is essential. And if it wasn't happening in Uganda, you could be absolutely certain it's not happening in the DRC or some of the other places that are much, much more troubled. So anything that all of you can do in the years to come to improve that would be time well spent on making a better world. Yeah.
Lord McConnell, all I can say is I agree, and let's get to work. But no, thank you very, very much for a very inspirational presentation. Thank you.